He left when I was just 7, leaving only a note, and never came back until I turned 25, asking for a chance to be my father again. I was 7 in the morning. I found the note. It lay on the edge of the kitchen table, neatly folded, resting beside an untouched cup of coffee that had already gone cold. My mother hadn't come downstairs yet, and for a moment, I thought it was something mundane, a shopping list or a message about picking me up from school. But when I opened it, the handwriting wasn't hers. It was his. My father's words were sharp and controlled, like someone trying too hard not to feel. He wrote that he needed to leave, that he wasn't good for us, that the weight of responsibility had become too much. He ended with a line that clung to my chest for years. Maybe one day, when I'm better, I'll come back. Don't hate me until you understand. I remember sitting on the floor with that note, the kitchen tiles cool against my legs, trying to understand what being better meant. I waited for days, weeks, months for a knock, a letter, anything. But nothing came. My mother never spoke his name again. His picture disappeared from the wall. When people asked, she'd say, "It's just us now." And I learned to swallow the silence. Over time, I created a version of him in my mind, part ghost, part coward. He became the cautionary tale I told myself when I started to fail. Don't be like him. Don't leave people without answers. But that note, creased and hidden beneath old notebooks, always remained in my drawer. I never showed it to anyone. I never could, because part of me, even as a boy, knew that words written in goodbye don't always stay dead forever. They wait, just like I did. Growing up without him wasn't loud. It wasn't full of slammed doors or shouting matches. It was quiet, achingly so. The kind of quiet that slips into everyday moments. An empty seat at school plays, a missing hand during father-son events, an extra portion of dinner that always ended up in the trash. His absence was a shape in our house, not a person, something we had to walk around every day. I became good at pretending I didn't care. I stopped asking my mother where he was. I told classmates he was dead, just to avoid the questions. I learned how to hammer a nail, tie a tie, and drive a manual car without him. And with every milestone, there was a flicker of anger buried deep inside me. A flicker that whispered, "You should have been here for this. You left me to figure it all out alone." My mother carried the weight differently. She worked late, came home exhausted, and never once let herself cry in front of me. I admired her resilience and feared her silence. She never spoke ill of him, but that only made his absence louder. It gave it the dignity of choice, as if he'd done the right thing by leaving. Teenage years passed in a blur of quiet rage and determination. I built walls around myself, convinced that vulnerability was weakness, that the only thing I could rely on was self-sufficiency. I didn't know how to ask for help because I didn't trust it would stay. And yet, despite everything, I kept the note. Every time I moved, to university, to my first apartment, it followed me, tucked deep in boxes I didn't open, like an unspoken agreement with a ghost. I told myself it meant nothing, that I was only keeping it out of curiosity. But deep down, I think I feared what it meant to let go of it completely. Because as much as I hated him, I think a part of me still wanted to understand why he left, and if he ever truly meant to return. I turned 25 in the middle of winter. The kind of cold that gets into your lungs and sits there, heavy like grief that hasn't named itself yet. My friends took me out that night. Cheap beer, loud music, voices that tried too hard to sound grown. I laughed with them, smiled through every toast, played the part of the man I thought I'd become. But somewhere, quietly, I felt the echo of the boy who used to sit by the window, waiting for a figure that never arrived. The next morning, hungover and alone, I opened an old drawer I hadn't touched in years. Inside was a notebook from university, some faded receipts, and folded among them, the note. It was yellowed at the edges now, the ink softened by time. I unfolded it with the same care I had when I was 7. The words hadn't changed, but I had. Later that week, I received a letter. It came in a plain envelope. No return address. Just my name, handwritten in a style I hadn't seen since that morning in the kitchen. My hand shook as I opened it. Inside was a message short enough to fit on one side of the page. "If you're willing, I'd like to see you." I know I have no right to ask, but I never stopped carrying you with me. There was a number, no name, but I knew who it was. For days, I didn't call. I carried the paper in my coat pocket like a curse. I told no one. I walked through the city with it against my chest, the weight of it unfamiliar and unbearable. I had imagined this moment so many times. I thought it would feel like justice, like power, but it didn't. It felt like the beginning of a choice I didn't know how to make. I thought I'd feel something sharper, rage, maybe indignation, vindication. But instead, all I felt was a dull pull in my chest, like a string tugged loose from somewhere I thought was already sewn shut. I kept the letter folded neatly in my pocket for almost a week, taking it out only in private moments, as if it might disintegrate in public air. I tried to imagine the man who had written it. Not the man I remembered, the one who tucked me in at night and taught me how to whistle in the backyard, but the one who left. The man who folded a note beside a cold cup of coffee and vanished. The man who became an echo in every conversation I didn't know how to have. For years, I'd built a version of him out of anger. I used his name as a warning, a reason not to trust, an explanation for the gaps in me I didn't want to admit were still open. And now he was asking to exist again, not as a memory, not as a ghost, but as a living man. A man who wanted to be seen. I couldn't talk to my mother about it. She had never spoken his name since he left, and something in her silence told me she had sealed off that part of herself for good. I didn't want to reopen her wounds just to soothe mine. So I sat with it, walked with it, slept with it tucked beneath my pillow. I rehearsed phone calls I never made. I drafted text messages I never sent. I imagined what I might say if I ever saw him. Why now? What do you want from me? Or worse, why did you let me spend my life thinking I wasn't enough to stay for? But I said nothing, because the weight of a name, the name Father, was still too heavy to lift without shaking. I began talking to him in silence. Not out loud, just quiet, mental fragments while walking home from work or staring at the ceiling at 2 a.m. I imagined the things I'd never said. Accusations, questions, longings I'd buried so deep they had hardened into habits. In my mind, he listened, but he never interrupted. That made it easier. The truth was, I didn't know what I wanted from him. Closure? An apology? A confession that he had been selfish? Or maybe just the proof that I wasn't the one who had driven him away. As a child, I had wondered endlessly if I had done something wrong, if some invisible flaw in me had made him fold that note and walk out the door. The grown man I had become knew better. And yet, that small version of me, the one who never got to ask why, still whispered doubts when everything else was quiet. I tried to live normally. Wake up, go to work, laugh at coworkers' jokes, meet friend for dinner. But beneath it all, the question lingered. What if I answer him? I told myself not to. I told myself that people don't change after 20 years, that fathers who leave rarely become the fathers we wish they'd been. I repeated every line I'd ever used to defend my silence, to protect my anger like armor. But the edges of that armor had started to rust. Then one night, while out for drinks, a friend, Lena, asked about my family. She didn't know my history. When I told her, flat and brief, she looked at me not with pity, but with something else, a kind of understanding. She told me her father had been gone too. That years later, he came back, not as a hero, not with excuses, but just as a man who finally wanted to be known. And she let him. She said, "You don't have to forgive him, but maybe you should find out if he's worth forgiving." That stuck with me, more than I wanted it to. After that night with Lena, I started seeing pieces of him in places I hadn't before. A man holding his son's hand on the subway. A faded photograph in a thrift store frame. A voice on the street that matched the timbre I remembered from dreams I never recalled fully. He became a phantom stitched into the fabric of my daily life. Just out of reach, but impossible to ignore. I went home one evening and stood in front of my bathroom mirror longer than usual. I traced the angle of my jaw, the line of my brow, the shape of my mouth. I wondered how much of him was reflected in my face. People used to say I looked like him. I never knew if that was a compliment. The letter was still in my coat pocket. I unfolded it again, as if the words might change. "If you're willing, I'd like to see you. I know I have no right to ask." No right. That part repeated in my head the most. Because he was right. He didn't. And yet, he asked anyway. What do you do when someone who broke you offers no defense? Just a door left slightly ajar. I didn't know the answer, but I started to want one. That night, I wrote his number onto a napkin, then tore it up and flushed it. The next morning, I rewrote it from memory. I hated how easy it was to recall. Like part of me had memorized it the moment I saw it, knowing I'd come back to it, even if I didn't want to admit it. Later, I sat on my bed, phone in hand, thumb hovering over the call button. I didn't press it. Not yet. But for the first time since I was a boy, I whispered the word Dad without bitterness. Just once. Just to see how it fell in my mouth. It didn't hurt like I thought it would. And that scared me more than anything. I told myself I'd call him on Sunday. I planned it. Gave it a deadline. I cleared my afternoon, turned off notifications, even cleaned my apartment as if the physical order would quiet the chaos inside me. I sat by the window with the number typed into my phone. I stared at it for hours, but I never pressed call. Instead, I imagined what he might be doing at that exact moment. Was he pacing near a phone, waiting? Was he already assuming I wouldn't reply? Did he expect forgiveness? Or had he reached out just to relieve his own guilt? That day, the phone never rang, and I realized then that he wouldn't follow up. He wouldn't push. He was giving me the space he probably believed he'd never earned. And somehow, that made it harder. If he had demanded something, if he had written again, insisted on being heard, I could have stayed angry. I could have shut the door and felt justified. But silence leaves room for choice. And that terrified me. Over the next week, I spoke to no one about it. I went through the motions of normalcy, but everything felt slightly off, as though I'd left something unfinished on every page of my life. The part of me that had spent years building a fortress out of indifference was starting to crumble under the quiet weight of possibility. Then, one evening, I found myself talking to an old professor I trusted, someone who had seen me grow from a guarded student into something resembling an adult. I didn't tell him everything, just hinted at it. A letter, a long absence, a question I didn't know how to answer. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "Some people spend their whole lives waiting for the chance to be brave. You've been given one. The only question is, will you take it or let it pass and wonder forever?" That night, I didn't call, but I saved the number to my contacts. Not as Dad, just as a name I hadn't spoken aloud in 18 years. In the days that followed, the world moved on as if nothing inside me had shifted. People on the street still hurried past, coworkers still asked how my weekend was, and I still gave vague, easy answers. No one could see the quiet war unraveling behind my ribs. But I felt it every time I passed a father and child, every time I sat in silence too long. The letter, the number, his name, everything was waiting for me to act. And still, I hesitated. I tried to remember things clearly. The sound of his laughter, the way his hands looked when they cooked, the songs he played on Sunday mornings. But memory is a cruel archivist. It preserves what it wants and erases the rest. I could remember how I felt around him, safe, small, hopeful. But the details? Blurred, incomplete. And yet the wound he left was razor sharp. It had never dulled. I began rereading his note again, the one from my childhood. I don't know why I kept returning to it. Maybe I was searching for some hidden message I'd missed, something deeper than the tired phrases he wrote. Maybe one day, when I'm better, I'll come back. Don't hate me until you understand. At 7, I had no idea what that meant. At 25, it haunted me. Because what if he had truly believed he was doing the right thing? What if leaving was, in his mind, the most responsible choice? What if love sometimes looked like abandonment when you don't have the words or strength to explain? I didn't know if I believed that, but I wanted to. One night, I stood by the river where he used to take me to feed the ducks. I hadn't been there since I was a child. The place was smaller than I remembered, less magical. But the memory still lived there. I took out my phone. I stared at the name. I whispered aloud just once. Then, without fully realizing what I was doing, I pressed the call button. It rang. Once. Twice. Then he answered. The phone in my hand trembled with a weight I had never anticipated. His voice had sounded tentative on the other end. More uncertain than I remembered. More human. I left it ringing an extra second, as if that hesitation could buy me clarity. Then we spoke only to arrange a meeting. No details beyond time and place, as though we were strangers negotiating a business lunch rather than father and son finally facing each other. I arrived early at the small cafe by the river's edge, the same river where he once held my hand. The interior was warm, scented with coffee and fresh bread. I chose a table by the window, watching the street and the water beyond, willing my heart to stop racing. My palms were damp, my throat tight. I pulled the folded letter from my pocket and smoothed its yellowed creases again, as if it were a map to guide me through this uncharted territory. When he walked in, I looked away first, studying his back, broad but slightly stooped, and the rumpled coat he wore. He paused at the entrance, collecting himself, then scanned the room until he found me. Our eyes met, and something unspooled inside me. Years of absence, anger, longing, and the faintest flicker of hope. He slid into the seat across from me, without a word. I registered the thin scar across his wrist where I had once scraped my finger on a broken toy, the same scar that had once seemed trivial, now pulsing with shared history. He cleared his throat, and a single line escaped him. "I'm so sorry I left." It was the first full sentence I had heard him speak in 18 years. I recognized the timbre, gentle, remorseful, but the words felt insufficient, like dust on an old wound. I wanted more, explanations, excuses, proof that he had thought of me every day. Instead, I fumbled for a response, running through rehearsed questions that died on my tongue. We sat in that cafe for what felt like hours, the only sound the drip of the coffee machine and the quiet murmur of other patrons. At some point, he placed his hand on the table, palm down, an unspoken offer of connection. I stared at it, torn between recoiling and reaching out. Finally, I slid my own hand toward his and let our fingers brush. The contact was electric and terrifying, as though we were both unlearning years of guarded silence. He looked relieved, almost childlike in his gratitude, and whispered a quote from the old note, "I never stopped carrying you with me." I felt my resolve crack. In that moment, I understood. Forgiveness was not a gift for him alone, but a choice I was ready to make for myself. Our reunion had begun not with grand declarations, but with two selves willing to take the first step toward each other and toward healing. He leaned back, eyes fixed on the steam rising from his untouched espresso. The cafe's afternoon lull wrapped us in a fragile cocoon, outside world muffled by glass and warm light. He began to speak again, softer this time, as if each word cost him something precious. "I was lost," he said. "Our family was all I knew. I thought I could handle everything, but I wasn't strong enough. I let my fear become my decision." His confession hung between us. I felt a rush of conflicting emotions, relief that he admitted his guilt, anger at the years I'd spent pretending his absence didn't hurt, and a sudden, startling sympathy for the man across from me. He wasn't a monster I had built in my mind. He was merely flawed. He continued, voice catching. "I wrote that note and left because I believed vanishing was easier than facing my failures. I thought time away might make me better, but it only wounded us more." My chest tightened. Memories of childhood evenings replayed, him tucking me in, teaching me to whistle, moments I preserved like fragile glass. I realized then that forgiveness wouldn't erase his mistake, but it could mend the fractures in my own heart. I reached into my coat, hesitated, and placed the old note beside his cup. He looked down, recognition and regret flickering in his eyes. I didn't need to speak. The gesture said it all. He nodded, tears glistening. Silence fell, but it was no longer heavy. It felt like the breath between two notes in a melody, necessary, hopeful. We sat side by side, letting those long withheld words settle. And in that quiet space, I knew the hardest part was over, and the true journey of healing was only beginning. We stayed in that cafe until the light outside softened into evening, long after our drinks had gone cold. When he finally spoke again, his voice was steadier, as though admitting fault had lifted a weight from his shoulders. "I wish I could take back those years," he said, eyes meeting mine. "But I can't. All I can do is be here now, if you'll let me. I studied his face, the fine lines around his eyes, the slight tremor in his lips, and sensed the sincerity in every word. The anger I had carried for so long felt strangely distant, replaced by a cautious openness I hadn't known I craved. I don't expect everything to change overnight, I replied, voice low. I need time to rebuild trust, and you need to show up consistently. He nodded without hesitation. I understand. I will. Outside, the sky deepened into indigo, dotted with early stars. We walked down to the riverbank together, our steps tentative but in sync. I pointed to the water's edge where, long ago, he had taught me to feed the ducks. He smiled, a small gesture that carried years of remorse and hope. I remember, he said quietly. We paused, just watching ripples spread across the surface. The silence was different now, shared and companionable rather than isolating. It held the possibility of many conversations yet to come, of moments to prove he was here to stay. When we parted that night, he placed his hand on my shoulder, an echo of that first touch in the cafe, and said, "Thank you for giving me a chance." I nodded. "Thank you for asking." I watched him walk away, silhouette shrinking against the lantern-lit path, and felt a lightness I hadn't known in years. It wasn't complete closure, but it was a beginning. And for the first time since I was 7, I believed a question left unanswered could lead to something more than pain. It could lead to healing. In the days that followed, our conversations grew from cautious to genuine. He called regularly, sometimes to share trivial details, like a new recipe he'd tried or a book that reminded him of our Sunday mornings. Other times, he asked about my life, his voice tinged with a careful curiosity as he caught up on years he'd missed. Each call ended with a promise, "I'll see you soon." And for the first time, I believed him. One afternoon, I invited him to my apartment. My living room felt bare without the weight of my old defenses, but I'd set out 2 mugs and a pot of tea, hoping our shared rituals might fill the space. He arrived carrying a small potted plant, daffodils, I later learned, and placed it on the windowsill where morning light would reach it. The gesture struck me, life continuing, fragile yet resilient. We sat on opposite ends of the sofa, sipping tea in companionable silence. I watched him trace the curve of the mug with his fingers and realized how much I'd missed these small, human moments. "Thank you," I said quietly. He looked up, genuine gratitude in his eyes. "For what?" "For showing up." He nodded, taking a breath before speaking. "I don't want to waste any more time." His words carried both regret for the past and determination for the future. I felt a swell of something I hadn't named yet. Relief, perhaps, but also anticipation for what might come next. Outside, a summer rain began to fall, tapping on the window pane in a soothing rhythm. We continued talking, sharing memories and admitting regrets, sometimes laughing at shared recollections I barely remembered, but which he described with vivid clarity. In his stories, I glimpsed the man I once admired, a father striving to care, even when he lacked the courage. When the rain eased, he stayed to help me clear the mugs and straighten cushions. His movements were deliberate, as if mindful of every action's significance. And in those ordinary tasks, I saw the heart of our reconciliation. The choice to rebuild through countless small moments, each one laying another brick in a bridge between us. As he left, daffodils swaying by the window, I stood in the doorway and felt the quiet certainty that forgiveness was not a destination, but a path we were already walking together. The weekend, after our tea, I invited him to join me at the small farmer's market I visited every Saturday morning. The air was crisp with the scent of fresh bread and herbs, and I found myself pointing out my favorite stalls. Homemade cheeses, local honey, the stall where I always bought wildflowers. He followed my lead, carrying the basket I handed him, and I realized how natural it felt to share this routine with him, as though he had never been gone. We paused at a stall selling hand-thrown pottery. I picked up a small bowl patterned with blue waves, something I always admired as a child, and he surprised me by purchasing it for my kitchen. I watched him hand over his card, feeling the old guard of skepticism soften slightly. When he turned back to me, the bowl wrapped carefully, He offered a shy smile, a silent acknowledgement of his intent to be present in these everyday moments. Later, as we sat on a bench overlooking the river, I caught him studying my face. "You've grown into yourself," he said softly. His words weren't praise or flattery. They were acknowledgement of the man I'd become without him. I felt a rush of gratitude that he had noticed the life I'd built in his absence, and that he wanted to be part of it now. I realized then that healing didn't demand grand gestures. It was in the shared silences between stalls, in the gentle act of carrying a basket, in the quiet approval in his eyes as I chose the wildflowers. The gap between us felt less like an abyss and more like a path slowly being paved. When we parted that afternoon, I looped the pottery bowl onto my arm, its blue waves echoing the river's flow. He waved goodbye, and I waved back, sensing that each small moment like this carried us further down the road we had only just begun to walk together. A week later, he visited my office unannounced, bearing a canvas tote with a thermos of coffee and the pottery bowl he'd bought at the market. "Thought you might need a refill," he said, setting up at the corner of my desk. The gesture was effortless, casual, the kind of support I had once assumed he'd never offer. We spent the lunch hour walking through the nearby park. Leaves rustled overhead, and sunlight dappled the path like scattered memories. We spoke of future plans, a fishing trip he promised when the weather cooled, an invitation to meet his partner and grandchildren, a tentative idea of repairing his old shed by the river. None of these were grandiose. They were ordinary invitations to share time and life. In his voice, I heard humility and hope. In my own, I found patience and a willingness to trust again. Each step felt lighter, as if the years of anger and doubt were finally loosening their hold. When we returned, I poured us coffee, his from the thermos, mine fresh from the office machine, and handed him the pottery bowl, now pressed against my hip. "It belongs in my kitchen," I said, "just like you." He smiled, a slow, genuine grin that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Thank you," he replied. I nodded, realizing that forgiveness had not erased the past, nor did it demand perfection. It simply opened the door to conversation, to shared mornings, to the possibility of being a family again. As he walked back to his car, I watched him go without the old weight in my chest. The note, folded now in a small box on my shelf, felt like a quiet testament to how far we'd come. And for the first time, I believe that a wound left open can become the door to something more lasting than absence, something called home.